This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to
Galen, Matt,
Gunnar, Mark,
Simon,
Alexander, Catherine,
G,
Tilo, Emilia,
Jeremy,
Jeff, John,
Bert,
Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace,
James,
Nick,
Mershan,
Galen,
Gareth,
Arlen, Bo,
Christopher, Michael,
Gigadelic Media,
Will,
Chance, Chase, Dan,
Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13,
Kathleen, David,
Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast,
Jamie,
Enoch,
Gary,
Max,
Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho,
Brian,
Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I want to remind you before we begin this edition of the program that I need your support on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. I am without any advertisers or sponsors, so your help keeping this show afloat is needed now more than ever, especially in the turbulent times we're living in, where it feels like history is happening at a breakneck pace. The past week in particular has been wild, and I'm trying to keep you, dear listener, informed and up to date with the latest perspectives on various events transpiring around the world. On this edition of the program, we're going to be continuing our coverage of Syria, this time with independent scholar and political commentator Wahid Azal. Wahid provides a very interesting perspective. He is the founder of the Fatimiya Sufi Order and is very knowledgeable on issues related to esotericism and Sufism. However, we're going to be discussing another area that interests him, which is geopolitics and the Middle East. You can read some of his commentaries on politics at websites like Counterpunch, also his blog, Wahid Azal, WAHIDAZAL 303.blogspot.com. On that blog, he recently penned a piece that was originally a Facebook post but later got taken down, entitled The End of the Axis of Resistance, wherein he lays out why he believes the overthrow of Assad and the situation currently unfolding in Syria will be the beginning of the end for the Islamic Republic in Iran. For those familiar with Wahid Azal already, they'll know that he is a very staunch critic of the Islamic Republic, but he's also extremely critical of the US, Turkey, and Israel when it comes to their influence in the region. We're going to be delving into that in this conversation. We'll also talk a little bit about HTS, the group of Syrian rebels that proved pivotal in the overthrow of Assad. All that and much more in the conversation to follow. With that being said, let's get right to it with Wahid Azal. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A friend of the show and returning guest, Wahid Azal. He's an independent scholar and political commentator based out of Australia. And we're going to be talking about Syria and what this means for Iran and the death of the axis of resistance, as some have called it. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy few days trying to cover everything that's transpiring, but
I guess what's your initial take, not necessarily on the axis of resistance part and what this means for Iran, but rather what has transpired in Syria in the past few days?
What has transpired in Syria over the last few days is basically, well, obviously, it's the end of the Assad regime, the Ba'ath regime that came to power actually in the late 1960s. His father took over in 1971 in a internal coup within the Ba'ath party. And what has transpired is that basically Turkey, NATO, backed the rebels that they had already been backing. These are the various al-Qaeda affiliates, such as this, Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS that is run by a gentleman, Mr. Jolani, who was one of the co-founders of ISIS. And before that, he was the head of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was one of the main al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. And they basically made a final assault within practically a few days after the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel began, and went for broke. And it appears that the Syrian army crumbled. They didn't want to fight. There were mass desertions throughout these various towns that this HTS coalition took one by one each city without so much as a shot being fired at any of them. And within less than a week, about 7 days, the regime in Damascus crumbled completely, and Bashar al-Assad left Syria. And as far as we know, he has taken asylum in Moscow, in Russia.
So, in terms of what this means for Iran, what's your? I know you have some predictions. I think you believe that, Iran is going to fall soon.
Yes, it is. I think the writing is now on the wall. If I was a little bit incredulous, maybe about a week ago, I am no longer. It is obvious that the actual final part of this operation that began in 2023 is going to culminate with basically dislodging the mullahs in Iran, the mullahs regime. So this is going to happen. Now, how it happens is going to be the question. Is this going to be a mainly military engagement, or are they going to try to foment the population? There are massive grievances amongst probably the mass of the Iranian population still pre-existing from the aborted woman life freedom revolution. Many people were either executed or imprisoned during all of that. Now with Pezeshkian as the president of the Islamic Republic since the death of Raisi, he doesn't seem to be able to placate the hardliners in the system. They have the parliament, they have the national security apparatus in their hand, and he's basically impotent. He's an impotent internal figure, but even on the wider international level, or what some people call on the geopolitical level, there seems to be this dissonance happening between what the hardliners are doing in Iran and what the reformists are trying to do. And all of this is just basically creating this cauldron that now, with the fall of Syria and basically the disintegration of the axis of resistance, means that Iran is in the crosshairs, and there's something coming very soon. If not, maybe immediately, like next week. I think by the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration, you can pretty much take it to the bank that there's big events that are going to brew. Yeah.
I have to be honest, in the past few days, I've been a little bit, I've voiced skepticism that this is going to be the death blow for Iran. I do think it's a big blow for Iran. So maybe you could convince me that this may well be the death blow.
Iran banked or at least the elite of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's not talk about Iran, because Iran is, as far as I'm concerned, is the Iranian people, and the regime is one thing, the people are another thing.
You would prefer if I called it the Islamic Republic, yeah.
All right. The Islamic Republic, the elite, the ruling elite of Iran, made an investment as of pretty much about 20, 30 years ago in creating what they called this arc of axis of resistance. Main component being Syria. Eventually, Iraq came into the mix. Then after that, the Houthis of Yemen, and Hamas, obviously, as the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. And all of these various components have been pretty much destroyed. Hamas, other than the Qassam Brigade, which is its military wing, as an organization is pretty much a shell of what it was. Even a year ago, it lost Hania in that assassination in Tehran. Its main radical military in I forget his name right now was murdered only about a month ago. And so
You mean Sinwar or?
yeah, I'm Sinwar. His name just escaped my head just right now. Sinwar is gone. They don't have any other leadership of that kind of caliber of Sinwar or Hania and similar anymore. And Hezbollah has been effectively neutered. It lost Nasrallah at the end of September. Most of the other leading ranking leadership were taken out. And then there's Saifuddin, who was the deputy, who's now the head of Hezbollah. He's in Tehran, apparently, from what we know. He's not even in Lebanon. And even though Hezbollah gave a hell of a fight to the IDF on the ground in southern Lebanon, Israel controlled the air. And in conventional warfare, that's what matters, ultimately. If you control the skies, you control the battlefield, even if Hezbollah really gave Israel a fight of its life, as they did in 2006 as well.
So then, I do agree with you, by the way. When the Trump administration comes in, I think Iran is going to be dealing with, or the Islamic Republic has a lot on its hands because there's a lot of hawks backing Trump right now and involved in his administration. In terms of what this means for the Middle East more broadly, what do you think are the most important points we need to keep in mind? Because right now, I think there's this problem we have when talking about just any conflict in the Middle East, where people take a very Manichaean view, as if there's just clear good guys and bad guys. And I think you're one of the few that doesn't take that perspective.
Well, I think everybody's a bad guy. I think only mom and pop at the ground, just average people are the good guys, and everybody else, these geopolitical actors, are all the bad guys. But I listen to a variety of voices online. I read a variety of things. One thing that is becoming very evident to me is that what began with the Abraham Accords when Trump was president has been one of the guiding principles of what we're beginning to see now in the Middle East. And that is the Gulf countries in an alliance with Turkey and loosely with Israel and the West are trying to basically, number one, end this axis of resistance, which I think they have succeeded, for a long-term kind of, pacifying of the region, but kind of in a gentrified kind of vision of that, so that, the Middle East flowers as a kind of a conflict-free zone where there's a lot of development and a lot of gentrification happening, and that the Palestinian issue is basically dead. There's no more resistance to Israel by the locals or any other force in the region. And the only thing right now that is kind of standing in the way of that is Iran itself. They took out the resistance, which was kind of Iran's quasi-imperial arm in the region. So that it remains for Iran to be dealt with. And then ultimately, empire itself has both China and Russia on its scope. They are, I think, very serious in wanting to take out the BRICS because they have begun to see it as a serious threat. Whereas I think maybe even a year or two ago, it was still kind of looked upon as this kind of a fringe thing. I think over the last 18 months, the seriousness of multipolarity as, even a potential has been looked upon by the powers that be in the West as a real threat. So a lot of this, in the background is about, the war of unipolarism against multipolarism, although I'm not a big fan of the BRICS or the kind of multipolarism that is advocated by Russia or, Mr. Dugin and et cetera, because I think it's kind of the reverse side of the cone of the unipolarism that we have had. And plus, it will make the world much more unstable than even now. But this is basically the bottom line, that the United States and its allies in Europe and Israel are going for the jugular.
So in terms of what comes next, I mean, well, even before we get to that, where do you think the axis of resistance went wrong? Like, give me your full criticism.
I have looked at this whole situation from multiple perspectives. Number one, I am not fully convinced of the official narrative around October 7th, 2023 at all. What happened there defies common sense. Even if we grant the argument that this was a operation that Hamas itself cooked up, I cannot believe that Hezbollah and Iran would have been out of this planning stage, because this was a big thing. And anyone who knows anything about planning for such things would have to put Iran and Hezbollah in the know about something coming. And if this is the case, that they did this without taking other things into consideration, it was overreach of a spectacular and epic level that they, and this is the result. On the other hand, it could be that Israel knew that this was being cooked up, and they kind of planned on capitalizing on this, overreach that Iran and its proxies, attempted on October 7th. And so here we are, because, the right in Israel before October 7th had its back against the wall by the population itself. They were trying to take out that government, the people, because of the kind of draconian anti-democratic laws that they were trying to push through the Israeli parliament by neutering the Israeli judiciary, etc. And this was unacceptable to most of the urban Israeli public. So, this was the best thing that could have happened to Netanyahu and his cronies in government. And so they did this, but from a larger perspective, these conflicts in that region, as far as I think the Gulf states and the elite class in the Gulf states were concerned, were just going on for too long. And the things that were promised in the Abraham Accords were not transpiring. And obviously, Iran wanted to be the spoiler factor. They wanted to end the Abraham Accords because that meant that the economic and geopolitical influence of Iran would have been cut to size in a very kind of a low-level kind of level with the Abraham Accords if they had proceeded in the way that was originally conceived. So all the parties, I guess, on each side did their thing. And I think the Israelis allowed this to happen because by destroying the axis of resistance, the last excuses that any of these Gulf Arab countries would have, or their elites would have, about going through with these accords was now gone. So now we're kind of with the end of and demise of Hezbollah. I think we're about to see some kind of the final stages of this whole thing, and then with Iran out of the picture, or the Islamic Republic out of the picture, I think, which is probably going to transpire over the next year, we're going to see a completely different Middle East, and where that will leave the population at large in that region is not in a good place. That means that essentially, even though we may have the old-styled Arab dictatorships of either the secular or the religious kind gone, what you're going to have is going to have the kind of societies that we're already seeing in the Gulf emerge throughout most of the Middle East, whether it be in Syria, if Syria even remains intact as a singular nation, definitely in Iraq, and if the mullahs go, then the next thing that you're going to see a massive avalanche of investment coming to Iran that is just going to build up Iran and turn Iran into, a kind of a Las Vegas kind of country, for lack of a better term. That's what's coming. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about Turkey because it seems like they're a beneficiary in all of this. And, I get frustrated with how some in the US, some analysts I've spoken to will sort of look the other way with Turkey.
Yeah.
I've had anti-Putin voices that sort of shy away from criticism of Turkey because, Turkey is part of NATO and, oh, well, we're against Russia, so we need to be, pro-NATO. We can't criticize Turkey. And I think that's a mistake because Turkey and Erdogan, I think, are, I think Turkey is not an honest player.
No, they're not. No, Erdogan has not been an honest player. He proved that during the last decade, right at the very beginning of the Arab Spring, especially when the war in Syria started. Turkey has been an intrinsic component in the destabilization of Syria from that moment. In February, May of 2011, They have many interests. One of it is the Kurds in Syria, because an autonomous Kurdish Syrian region basically galvanizes the flank of Kurds in Turkey itself. And this has been an ongoing conflict from basically the foundation of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s up to now. And, that's one reason for it. The other reason is that Erdogan basically wants to create a sort of a neo-Ottoman kind of empire in that region, with Turkey as the leading, power in that region. That is one of the motivations for Erdogan.
You elaborate on that a little bit, and maybe you could talk about Turkey's involvement in Syria, even
Sure.
in the years prior to Assad's
Sure.
overthrow, because I think that's an important part of the picture.
Well, Tayyip Erdogan is the head of a party, the AKP, that came into the Turkish political system in different iterations as of the 1980s. In one instance, during 1990s, it won parliamentary elections, then it lost, then it came back again with Erdogan himself. And then steadily over the zeros and leading into the teens, it just clawed power completely and dismantled the secular Kemalist state. The AKP are primarily Muslim brothers. They're a Turkish franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're Islamists, but a kind of a modernist Islamist iteration. They're not takfiris in the sense that we see in some of these Salafist organizations like ISIS or al-Qaeda, etc. But nevertheless, they're Islamists, and their vision is as dangerous, if in some ways more dangerous, than I would say some of these Salafists, because with the Salafists, they are a known quantity, but with the Muslim Brotherhood, externally they appear modern, they appear Western, they appear rational, but their agenda is to create a kind of a Sharia-based state with a very narrow-minded Sunni Hanafi kind of interpretation of the Sharia, which would then marginalize minorities, women, you name it. Yeah.
In terms of HTS, I keep seeing analysis from I hear all sorts of things about HTS and al-Jolani. I think there's people trying to say, oh, he's not a jihadi anymore. I see people saying, well, he is a jihadi. I see other people saying sort of this middle ground of he may have moved away from jihadism, but he's still ultra conservative. What's your take on him?
If it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. I mean, look, there's different ways to look at it. These people are Islamists, they're Salafists. On the other hand, ultimately, al-Qaeda and all of its affiliates are, as someone coined the term a long time ago, al-CIA, duh. So depending on who is pulling his strings directly, I mean, at the moment, the rhetoric that is coming out of his mouth and out of HTS itself is very placating, and they're announcing amnesties to former Ba'athist government personnel and whatnot. The other day, they very gentlemanly escorted the prime minister out of his offices and to a hotel across the street. So this is what they're doing now. But then we're hearing stories sporadically from various places that some of these HTS are, engaging in reprisals, or engaging in the kind of things that we saw during the last decade as well. And I think, despite the good behavior face that they may have put on right now, eventually these people are going to show their true colors, and that all depends on, what kind of developments we see over the next couple of weeks. I mean, at the moment, Israel has invaded through the Golan. They've taken Qantara, all of that area of the south. So they're creating a buffer zone. I think good luck to Syria to ever see that back again, just like they never got Golan back. So all of this it does not bode well that either these HTS people or any of these other groups affiliated with them are going to, peacefully transition into something. However, the agenda of these Gulf elites and these investors is precisely stability. They want stability. So the question that needs to be asked is that how much pressure or how much influence do they have on Jolani and his HTS specifically to bring about this stability and how much Israel itself is willing to then play with that game with its Gulf allies. That is the question, the unanswered question at the moment.
I wanted to ask you about what Israel is doing now with its airstrikes. So this is from the Associated Press earlier today. Israel's foreign minister says it struck suspected chemical weapons sites and long-range rockets in Syria in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of hostile actors. And I found this interesting because the first thing that I said and a bunch of other people said was, well, so they knew about Assad and the chemical weapons and where they were this whole time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, basically, they want to neutralize anything that emerges over there in Syria. If these Islamists get any big ideas that they now want to extend their jihad into Palestine itself and liberate the Palestinians, that plan is gone now. They don't have very much of anything. And basically, it's also about weakening or even eliminating any potential armed, regular armed forces in Syria emerging in a post-Assad period. So they want it weak, where Israel remains the only bad cop in the region, basically, other than Turkey.
That's why, I don't know if you can comment on this or maybe push back on it a little bit, but that news about Israel going after chemical weapons, it made me wonder if they really wanted Assad to fall or to be ousted, or if they would have rather had sort of a weak Assad. But do you think they wanted him overthrown?
It's difficult to tell. I mean, both of the narratives have their pluses and minuses. On the one hand, a secular Ba'athist state with some kind of a under the table agreement with Israel, you would think would be more to the benefit of the Israelis than what has now transpired. But we are not living in the pre-Abraham Accord era. We're living in the post one. And the issue is that most of these Takfiri groups, in one way or another, have their strings controlled by these various Gulf entities, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, etc. So that is where I think this whole narrative about, this they wanted Assad still in, I think that goes out the window the minute we realize that this was orchestrated. This was also something that those Gulf Arab states want because Bashar was in the way. And if you look at certain events that transpired over the last couple of months where Assad was both being courted and at the same time being shunned by these Gulf Arab states, it kind of signals that there was something afoot. Assad in the last few months, especially the last couple of weeks, was going on record even, claiming that it wanted to expel the Iranian presence from Syria, and that, he was basically trying to give everything that these Gulf Arab states wanted. But on the issue, I think it's with his dispute with Erdogan over northern Syria and those areas around Idlib that the Turks have occupied since the end of that war in 2017. This was kind of the linchpin that then forced the hand of Turkey itself, because their negotiations weren't going anywhere. But otherwise, I mean, Syria was, or Assad, Bashar al-Assad was just giving everything away. And this was raising the flags of everybody in the so-called resistance axis. I was following a lot of these accounts on Twitter, etc. And, there was a lot of chaos about what was going on. There was no consensus on whether this was all a kind of a game or what was going on. And then you were reading that when I was reading the Iranian press, there was 10 different views from different people about what was going on with Syria. Certain hardliners were claiming that Assad was beginning to sell us out. Others were saying, no, this is just, buying time. So it was obvious that there was something afoot. And then once this ceasefire with Israel happened, this was the first thought that came to my mind, that if any ceasefire is to hold between Israel and Hezbollah, then as far as Israel is concerned, that whole cordon in southern Syria that goes through Iraq and into Iran would need to be cut off to Hezbollah, ultimately. This was the first thing that occurred to me, and lo and behold, within a couple of days after that ceasefire was negotiated and announced, this all begins from northern Syria, from Idlib itself, where the Turks are located.
Where do you think people are getting their analysis wrong on Syria right now? Because I think you provide a perspective that uh, pushes back on a lot of different sides.
Yeah.
So where do you think people are getting things wrong, or where they're maybe being mis or disinformed?
Um, I mean, the general public out there, I think, especially with much of the Western left, are getting their facts wrong because they don't have a proper historical understanding of this conflict from its beginning and who its actors really are. I mean, I have seen people cheerleading for these Islamist groups, who are as reactionary as you can possibly imagine. I mean, I am no fan of Dugin, Russia, or any of those people on the tankies. I have no fan of these people at all. But on this particular issue, they are right about the groups in Syria during this conflict and who they represent and what they have been doing. I'm primarily thinking of one person who I've followed for a very long time, although I disagree with his larger view about the world, but nevertheless, his analysis on Syria has been spot on every time. This is Syriana analysis, Kevork Almasian. He's one of the better people amongst this crowd of people whose analysis has usually been right, without, give or take a few details. And he called this a couple of weeks ago, that he thought that this was where all this was headed, and he called it. So if you go to his page and listen to his podcast in the lead up to all of this, he was already seeing this unfold. And he has called these various groups for what they are from the very beginning, since he began his journalistic career back in around 2011 and 2012. Whereas the punditry, the mainstream punditry in the West, is just either out to lunch, or they're just engaging in outright propaganda about the nature of these groups in that region. I mean, I don't like Assad. I don't like Baathists, generally speaking, whether they came in their Iraqi Saddamist version or their Assadist version. But, if you want to look at these issues pragmatically, if you have to choose between these secular authoritarian types versus these head-chopping Takfiri Islamists, I think the choice is pretty clear for any rational person. This is unfortunately the situation that we face in that region.
Could you speak a little bit more to where you think this is all headed? I mean, obviously, you're saying that, Assad, we're not cheerleading him at all, but you're saying that we could end up very well with something even worse than Assad in Syria.
This all depends on whether Jolani and HTS can keep the ISIS demon in the bag for as long as possible, right? And that all depends on their performance. If their performance goes south, then their own people are going to start to get even more further radicalized, and this will bring ISIS as the leading contender against HTS, as happened, during the last conflict. And if that happens, then you can very quickly see the re-emergence of a ISIL emirate in Syria, which would then want to cross over into Iraq and recreate what it tried to create back in 2014 and 15. And this is the worst case scenario, especially with a weakened Iran, a Hezbollah that is no longer there, and no other opposition to this. And this would quickly take over that part of the Middle East in very rapid succession. The only question is what these Gulf Arabs want. As I said, I think they want stability. They want to develop that region and gentrify it, and just basically pacify all of these conflicts and put all the radicals put in their box permanently. And Iran is one of these. So that's the wild card here. What happens? Yeah.
What do you think the best case scenario is?
Well, the best case scenario is where all these elites everywhere collapse. That's the best case scenario we have.
Plausible. What about plausible best case?
The plausible best case scenario, I mean, I am no fan of the IRI, the Islamic Republic of Iran. However, I do not want to see Iran have the son of the Shah brought back and installed as the new Shah of Iran. because these
You broke up there for a second. You said you don't want to see.
the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, installed as the ruler of as the new ruler of Iran, because this is what the West and Israel are signaling, that they want to do a redux of 1953. So if that happens, there's several problems here. One problem is that it will legitimize the Islamic Republic and its rulers today. We don't need that. If this regime is going to go, it needs to be completely de-legitimized on its way out permanently. And also it will stop this organic process of a genuine Iranian form of democratic polity emerging, which is, I think, what needs to happen. And this has been the historical process since the turn of the 20th century with Iran's constitutional revolution, that each time has been interfered with by either the reactionary forces in Iran itself or the imperial powers outside of it. So we need to get to this homegrown organic democracy that has been struggling to emerge in Iran for the last 100 something odd years.
I feel like this is one of the biggest problems in the Middle East, and I don't know if you'll agree or disagree, but I feel like, whether it's Syria or Iran, or even Gaza, the people that live in these states aren't really allowed to forge their own destinies. They're not, everyone is treated as a pawn, like Syrians are caught in the middle of, average Syrians are caught in the middle of various factions, whether it's Israel or Turkey or Assad, and no one is really allowed self-determination in a way. And I think that's true with Iran as well.
Yeah, it's been true with Iran for the last 100 years, not just recently. The Islamic Republic of Iran has capitalized from its very foundation that they are the anti-imperial, people-powered movement, but they very quickly proved that the opposite of that internally when they, created the most authoritarian or even totalitarian system that the Iranians have ever experienced. But you're right. People are not allowed to determine their own sovereignty in that region. And that is, I think, ultimately what plays into the hands of empire imperialism. They want a weak region. They want a basket case, because if this region genuinely flourishes with genuine sovereignty from the ground up, it threatens, the imperial dominance ultimately.
Can you speak more to the West's endgame? Because we've talked about the Gulf states and Israel, but
well, the West's endgame is full spectrum dominance. The rule of capital. Which is what this is. That is the end game.
So in terms of where things are headed, what do you think the biggest flashpoints are? What do you think that people need to keep an eye out for going forward?
Watch Iraq over the next couple of weeks. Now that Syria's gone, I think there's going to be an attempt to either create a political crisis in Baghdad with the current government, or something is going to transpire of that level within Iraq. And then once that deck is cleared, I think the signposts are everywhere that Iran is definitely in the crosshairs as of probably the first week of the incoming Trump administration.
We haven't talked much about Palestine, and I think we should do that because all eyes are on Syria now, but the Palestinian plight still matters. So let's speak about that and maybe connect it to what's happening.
Well, this strategy that Turkey and Israel and America affected was ingenious because it immediately split the consensus around the world on the issue of Palestine, and particularly with Muslims themselves and Syrian Muslims. So whereas, 2 days before, people were still talking about the Palestinian issue and that there is a genocide, a literal genocide of World War II proportions unfolding in Palestine, all of a sudden the attentions shift from that to what they think is the liberation of Syria, which it isn't, but that's a whole different conversation. Palestine and the Palestinian cause is being literally destroyed. So we are living in a Nakba 2.0. The Nakba that began in 1948 under Ben Gurion obviously is now coming to its conclusion under these Jabotinsky Zionist revisionists of the caliber of Netanyahu and his cohorts. and the Palestinian cause is dead. I don't see. I mean, obviously, the Trump administration is not going to want to talk about any kind of two-state solution or one-state solution, whatever state solution anymore. So we are watching, at least in the current timeline, the death of the Palestinian cause. And I mean, you look at Gaza, some estimates put the number of people killed by Israel since October 9th, 2023 is above 100,000. I mean, the official figures are in the 40,000 ballpark, but other figures are putting it way above that, reaching close to the 200,000 mark of people who have been murdered since that time. Now they're going for the West Bank. So there's a lot happening in the West Bank as well, which means that these settler Zionists in the West Bank have convinced the Israeli government that it should now turn its attention there as well. So that you could probably see over the next year, if there's no power to stay the hand of Israel, you could even see the Palestinian Authority leaving as well, just going into exile from the West Bank.
Do you see any wild cards at play that could push things in another direction, whether it's with regards to Palestinians or the broader Middle East?
I think economics is going to be the wild card. And, various channels that I follow that look at markets and bond markets and whatnot are talking about a possible banking collapse in the United States. They instanced the Bank of America is being in trouble, and that an incoming Trump administration, peopled by economic libertarians, is not going to want to bail out a collapsing U.S. banking system. So that is what can possibly stop all of this. On the other hand, it could also be the reason that is motivating these actors to move in the manner that they're moving at the moment in the region, to kind of consolidate certain things before this economic crisis hits the United States.
Just a few more things here. I also wanted to mention the Turkey-Israel relationship, because I see a lot of debate about it. There will be people that say to me, "Oh, well, Erdogan is, at least in his rhetoric, being more critical of Israel." But, I don't think in action,
No,
Turkey and Israel have really severed relations that much.
no, they don't. They're actually quite close. There's very intimate economic ties between Israel and Turkey. Erdogan plays the frenemy card very well, but the fact of the matter is that they're friends. And whether it was under the Kemalists or now under the Muslim Brotherhood, Erdogan and Turkey, the Turkish establishment, has seen it better in its long-term interest to be closer to Israel than distance from it. So Erdogan's rhetoric is basically for his constituencies, for his grassroots constituency. But effectively, the Turkish state and the Turkish elite are dealing with the Israelis on a regular basis. I mean, you go to towns like Izmir, the coast of the Mediterranean, and it's like every other tourist is Israeli over there. And the same thing is also happening on the Turkish side of Cyprus at the moment as well. So, where's the conflict?
Do you think that's true with regards to the Russia-Israel relationship as well? I'm just curious. I don't know your thoughts on it, but
that is a complicated relationship because, I mean, at least on paper, Putin and the Russian Federation are allies of Israel. But, I mean, you can argue that the last couple of years, especially with the flare up the Ukraine conflict at the level it has, that this relationship has been very rocky because, we've heard, for example, stories of IDF and Mossad and Shin Bet being active in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side. And some of these, oligarchs in Ukraine having ties to Israel, etc. So it's questionable whether that relationship is as intimate or as close as it used to be. But at least on paper, I mean, Russia and Israel, are pretty close. This was the complaint of a lot of the resistance axis people during the last decade, that when Russia came into the Syria conflict in 2015, in certain instances, it was kind of helping the Israelis. For example, many of these airstrikes that were happening, killing, IRGC generals or Hezbollah, commanders, etc. in Syria, Russia did nothing to prevent them. In fact, there were rumors for a long time that the Russians may have even been giving intelligence to Israel to undertake these things. I don't think that's maybe the case, but nevertheless, that was the complaint. Now that relationship, I think, because of Ukraine, has probably transformed, and more Russia and Israel are finding themselves at the opposite sides of things. But before that, I mean, I heard talk by one particular individual who was saying to me that as the American empire wanes and the Russian one, the Russian power goes up, that Russia is going to become the new guarantor of Israeli sovereignty in the region. I don't think that's the case anymore. It may have maybe to some degree been the case, maybe up to even 2016, but not anymore.
So I think you know that I have a pretty broad range of listeners, and there's two types of listeners I wanted you to be able to address when it comes to Syria and the Middle East more generally. The first is I have more centrist listeners, that liberal centrists that what do you think they're getting wrong about Syria and the Middle East, and what would you argue with them about? Like, what would you say they're getting incorrect?
They're not reading the actors and events right, and that is due to the fact that they have very limited understanding of the history of the entire regional, problem and conflict since the end of the First World War. I mean, let's look at Syria itself. Syria, as a nation state, was created by the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1917 between the British and the French, and it fell under the French sphere of influence. So at the very end of the First World War, the French military marched into Syria and occupied it, and first created Syria and then created Lebanon right next to it as its two spheres of influence. And colonialism, or post-World War I colonialism, has been one of the narratives of the conflicts that have been fueled up to this point. The Baathists attempted to address this and to rectify it, but they failed primarily because then they split into two different major factions between the Iraqi Baathists and the Syrian Baathists. And the problems were exacerbated. But Islamism, that I think nobody really understands in the West other than academics, is the biggest problem, because Islamism, for lack of a better way of contextualizing it, is actually a recent ideology. And it is extremely modernist, despite its claims of wanting to go to a pristine past and whatnot. And it is a rejectionist ideology. That means that everything that has come before it in the Islamic historical experience is largely rejected by these Islamists. And this is where a lot of people in the West get things wrong. And then when you have this whole Islamophobic dynamic that conflates Islamism with the whole civilization in that area, is where then they start to make a lot of strategic mistakes in the decision-making process that happens. I mean, I would force, if I were in control of the United States, I would force these Congress people to, sit through university level courses for 2 semesters in the history of the Middle East, and test these people and quiz them daily, until they get it. And then once they got it, then, you send them to make decisions in Congress and in the foreign policy apparatus. So this has been the biggest problem that, at least in the United States, is that this conflict in the history of that region is not properly understood.
Can you elaborate more on like, Islamism is used in so many different ways in America. Like, what do you mean by Islamism? Are we talking about political Islam? What do you mean by that term?
Well, basically, Islamism is political Islam, right? It is, in a very weird sort of way, it is taking religion and denuding many large elements of its spiritual and religious praxis and transmuting it completely into a political focus. So that means that eschatology, theology, everything is subsumed into a political agenda, right? And where politics becomes the end game to everything. And from any point of view, when you sit down and analyze it, Islamism is a sort of a heresy, and it's a modernist one as well. It emerged largely at the end of the 19th century as a reaction to European colonial encroachment in the region, where some of the local intellectuals, especially in the Sunni world, looked upon the encroachment of the West on the Muslim world as the one of the reasons being is because the Muslim world had done things incorrectly, or their views and their religious practice were not up to the task of confronting the imperial West. So primarily, the first thing that these Islamists went after were the Sufis. This mystical, esoteric, and otherworldly kind of approach to religion was to blame for the material and military encroachment of the West into the Muslim world. But then, as these various movements developed, whether in their initial iteration as the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, under the watch of the British, I may add, British occupiers of Egypt, and then later after that into their Salafist and Wahhabi iterations that the British again emboldened, and in some cases, in the case of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they outright supported to take power. This has pushed many elements of the Islamic religion into the background, and then in the eyes of the West, it has basically created a monolith of what is Islam. And so here we are, where most of the Islamophobes in the West, the vision of Islam that they have is primarily of Islamists rather than Islamic civilization as a whole in its historical context.
And a lot of that Islamophobia network has its own agenda, and I mean a lot of them are think tankers connected to neocons. Yeah,
and there's money involved in this. It's also a business as well. Let's not forget that. Yeah, it's big business. But where I'm coming from, I mean, I'm at the opposite pole of what Islamism represents. I mean, to most of these people, someone like myself cannot get any more heretical. I talk about things like post-Islam, kind of counterposing, modernism and post-modernity, and creating a neologism called post-Islam, where you have an Islamic civilization that is flowered and ideologically beyond these kind of constructs the Islamists have imposed on it. And Sufism plays a big part in that. And, Azali Babism that I appear to also plays a big part in that. And this, what I represent is an absolute threat to what these people represent, these Islamists of all iterations, especially the Sunni ones.
Are you familiar by any chance with there was this Marxist economist, I think he was Egyptian French, Samir Amin. And
Yes,
I was going to ask about him because he's written, when he was alive, he wrote about political Islam in relation. I mean, he went as far as to call political Islam as being in service of imperialism.
he was right. He was right because at least let's look at the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood emerges in Egypt at the end of the 19th century at a moment where you had, for example, Egyptian nationalists and Egyptian liberal nationalists emerging primarily in the Wafd party that were challenging the presence of the British and the European colonialists in Egypt. And immediately their opposition voices emerged through the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, that historical documentation proves the British presence was actively cultivated. And then this ideology basically then spread through the region, beginning with the Levant and also into Turkey. And it has served empire. And by radicalizing situations, right, having this incessant, dialectic of conflict happening in that region, where you have these Islamist faces, basically makes the argument for empire amongst its own constituency about why it should intervene. Whereas if you had a completely different, reality in that region, if you had if the normative Islam of 200 years ago, which was Sufism in the Sunni world, was still around, what exactly would be the argument for imperial intervention in that region?
I know in this regard, I wanted to mention, I saw a recent video where you were referencing stay-behind operations.
Yeah.
How does that relate to the Middle East? You're talking about like Gladio-style stuff there, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, HTS itself is blatantly one of these, and it's been under the thumb of the Turks throughout this conflict since 2012-13. So Al-Qaeda at least in its Levantine operation and arguably in its operation in Iraq, has been a NATO Gladio stay behind operation all along. That's why, I mean, this is why this whole term al-Qaeda originally emerged, because of that very thing. Yeah.
Before closing out, the other group of people I wanted you to address here in America are well, they're not just in America, but I wanted you to address the sort of far left anti-US campists who, don't really want to be critical of, say, the Islamic Republic or Russia or, any of these states that they see as the adversaries of the US. Where do you think they're going wrong? And what do you make of the weird alliances that we're seeing between Duganists and these sort of anti-US campists on the left?
The alliance of the Duganists with these anti-imperial people on the U.S. campuses is a worrying one. I have warned these people through my own networks for years to, keep the Dugan people as far as they can possibly keep them. They are not friends. These people are fascist, period. What I would say to the folks on the campuses is that you need to know your information.
By the way, I didn't mean college campuses. I meant the sort of anti-US camp within the left.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the tankies essentially are neo-Stalinists. These are the people that you're talking about. And where in some areas maybe their analysis is okay, I think this alliance that they have had with the Russians and the Dugan network specifically does not speak well to their long-term, analysis of the situation. And they stand to discredit themselves, I think, very soon, especially when, I don't think even the conflict in Ukraine is going to go the way that many people are thinking it's going to go when Trump comes into office. Because of the people that he's appointing to his cabinet, I mean, this is signaling that they may not do the same things as the Biden administration did, but the agenda of the United States is basically checkmate Putin. And they're not going to give Putin, the Donbass and Crimea and whatnot. They're miscalculating. There's a lot of miscalculation happening, just like they miscalculated about the situation in Syria. And it's taken a lot of these people unawares, how this could have come about so quickly. And it did in Syria. I think the same thing is going to happen with their analysis of the situation in Ukraine. Their alliance with Dugan and his people. This is wrong because these people are basically a fascist Trojan horse and are as dangerous as empire itself.
Is there anything I didn't cover in this conversation that you think is particularly important that I missed?
No, but I will say that people stateside should keep their anti-war activism going. But they also need to really understand these conflicts and not jump on anybody's bandwagon. Advocate for people on the ground. When the war on Iran comes, which I am certain is going to come over next year, you advocate for people on the ground, not for governments, not for organizations. This is the thing that the peace movement in the United States needs to really get its head around at the moment, because we've had this problem consistently during this whole thing since October 7th, where gradually a lot of the peace movement has kind of gravitated into supporting Hamas. I think that is a tactical mistake, ultimately. Whatever you think about the role of Hamas in this conflict, advocate for the people of Gaza, not for Hamas as an organization, because they are Muslim brothers as well. They're Islamists.
Well, I want to thank you again, Wahid Azal, for coming on Parallax Views. It's always a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Wahid Azal. And as always, if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views. with Parallax Views. To Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.